As a YouTube viewer over the years, I've seen several videos that had some variation of this thumbnail. And while I'm sure there's some good information in each of them, I think the fundamental suggestion of this thumbnail is flawed, and I actually think the reverse might often be true. I mean, I get it, you gotta get those clicks, but hear me out on this one. Based on the questions that I asked before I started making these kinds of videos, it seemed like most people are concerned with their arrangement abilities, or at least we think we are. We all want that secret formula or shortcut that's going to transform what's currently sitting on our DAW timeline into a masterpiece. But maybe it's not the arrangement that's holding us back, maybe it's the ideas that we're attempting to arrange. Besides telling me less is more about half dozen times per lesson, my composition teacher used to say, "My feet are moving, so I must be dancing," to describe the attitude of a typical amateur composer. Or, as I've come to think of it since, the difference between Michael Phelps jumping into a swimming pool versus an amateur swimmer. Or worse yet, someone who can't swim at all. One has learned, practiced, and harnessed the power of precise, controlled movement, and the other sort of flails around and hopes for the best. So, in what the outside observer might consider a contradiction, the worse the swimmer, the more the movement. In one of my other videos about self-imposing limitations to focus your creativity, someone mentioned the piano itself as being very limited because you can't play all the notes at once, and therefore you can't possibly hear all the combinations of notes or hear all of the chords at the same time or all of the scales. But to that I would say, good. If a painter uses all of the colors on their palette at once, you essentially get some variation of brown. And unless that's the desired effect, a careful selection of limited options is far more effective. Take a single line instrument like the clarinet. The composer has to write an incredibly strong melodic idea for that instrument because it has to carry itself. There's nothing around to support it. So yes, the idiomatic restrictions of any given instrument are indeed limitations, but limitations are extremely effective conduits for creativity. And just like a world-class swimmer has mastered the art of subtlety and power in refined movement, a great composer knows how to use limitations and restricted movements to produce a desired effect. And if things are moving all the time, movement ceases to mean anything. We need contrast. Limitation is, in fact, so fundamental that there's an entire period of music that was fairly prolific that we now refer to as the classical period. But it also had another name, the common practice period. This period was incredibly formulaic. So much so that we might look at it now as too restrictive, and there's no way anyone could produce any sort of original music that would ever stand the test of time in that particular period, using those particular formulas. Oh, wait a second. Mozart and early Beethoven. These composers found ways to set themselves apart from their peers of the time within these restrictive laws and rules, common practices, aka limitations. And when they broke the common practice, it felt intentional, it felt like they were pushing boundaries, not because they didn't know how the rules worked, but because they understood where, when, and how to push those boundaries. It was a choice rather than done just through laziness or lack of skill. Today, there are not a lot of common practices anymore. Lots of experiments have been made, and it's kind of broken down all of the rules that we might associate with putting music together. And that's both creatively freeing and paralyzing. So you'll have to try things for yourself to determine what your personal set of rules are going to be. Your rules are determined by your taste, which means you've tried different things, you've said yes to this, you've said no to that, and your taste eventually becomes your artistic voice. Unfortunately, to develop taste, you will actually have to be able to do more than one thing. Just like you can't just have one shirt in your closet and claim that that's your favorite shirt of all the shirts. Taste requires choice, and choice requires options. But I think that whole topic might be for another video entirely, so I digress. Personally, this idea of less movement often equating to stronger ideas took a lot of getting used to because all of my years in piano had taught me to value technical ability above all else. So while we might look at a really good player and think, oh, if I could just play like that person or do all of those things that they can do, I would be totally set. Virtuosity with an instrument presents its own unique set of challenges when that person wants to then start to compose. Sometimes we have to choose between moving a listener emotionally, which I think is what most of us are after, or impressing them by an athletic event. Sometimes you can accomplish both, but for me, and the background that I come from, it's a bit of a slippery slope, especially in the world of the internet, which tends to celebrate sensationalism and bravado. I don't think cramming more notes into an idea is the solution. I think knowing which notes to leave out is probably more important, and what we often think of as a lack of ability in arrangement is a lot of times lack of ideas that are strong enough to withstand being arranged. So rather than adding more stuff, I think you should focus on making the stuff you have better. The stronger you make your initial idea, theme, melody, chord progression, sound design, whatever, the more mileage you can ultimately get out of it. And we avoid this fundamental step because this is work. But whatever gave us the impression that composing something memorable shouldn't be work. Once we give ourselves permission to struggle, we can have the patience with ourselves that we need to truly develop an idea and take it to the next level. I mentioned in a previous video that a really strong melodic idea can withstand variations, but I think even more importantly, it can withstand repetition and even beg for it. Maybe you've experienced this and you've heard a chorus that's so incredibly powerful, you almost tolerate the next verse just so that you can hear that chorus again because it just begs to be repeated. And that has less to do with the way things are arranged than it does the fact that that chorus is really strong to begin with. And then the arranger has tried to figure out the best way to put those things together so that it'll have as much impact as possible. But the core ideas have to be really strong. So let's say, for example, you take the time to develop two really strong ideas that kind of seem like they come from the same cloth, but are somewhat contrasting as well. Think of this like an A section and a B section, as I've talked about before. Once you have that, you basically have all of the pieces or the building blocks that you need to create a really strong musical narrative. And from that point, you can start to play around with arranging them in the best way that will be the most emotionally impactful for the listener, and that's just a process of trial and error. If you'd like to see more in-depth examples of how I personally handle these concepts of development, arrangement, composition, all of those kinds of things, it's all explained in more detail in my free ebook, which looks like this, and you can get in the description below. If you got anything out of this video, you can give it a like. If you want to see more stuff like this or more stuff about the synthesizers behind me, you can click subscribe. Leave me a comment below telling me what else you'd like to hear about in these topics of composition and arrangement and even some music theory. I've really enjoyed kind of re-exploring my own philosophies on these topics. And if you want to see that video about imposing more limitations on yourself, you can click this video here, and I will see you in the next one.